Hello and welcome to another episode of the Ergonatic podcast. We're here to talk about DevOps, platforms, all things operations and development. And today I have as a guest Steve Pereira, who is an amazing human being. Steve, would you like to tell us what you've been up to lately and what brought you here in your whole career?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me, Sasha. This is wonderful. I'm very pleased to see what you folks are working on, and I think there's definitely a gap in the market that I'm excited to see you folks tackling. So, I've been in tech for over 20 years now, and I've been all over. Like, I'm not a traditionally trained engineer, but I've always kind of been focused on workflow. And that's kind of been my focal point. And that's brought me through things like build and release engineering, lots of automation, and eventually to the point where I am now, which is focusing a lot on value streams, which for anyone who, is heard that buzzword and doesn't really, know what the big deal is, it, to me, this idea of looking at the end-to-end flow of work that starts with a customer in mind and ends with a customer being satisfied by a need or desire is really, really powerful. And so there's a bunch of things that kind of fueled that migration in my career, like reading things like The Goal and the Phoenix Project and understanding the theory of constraints and even things like personal flow, like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi's work on getting into a flow state. Like all of this kind of connects together. And I'm a big believer that to get individual flow as contributors, we need collective flow. We need to be working in teams and organizations that are enabling flow across different departments, different capabilities, different proficiencies and specialties. And so I spend a lot of my time working with organizations to kind of map out their flow and find where the constraints and the bottlenecks and the opportunities are.
So that's an interesting idea. I don't think we've discussed this before, but I mostly see people like see personal flow versus like organizational flow as very different concepts. And you're kind of connecting them here. So talk a little bit more about this. Is it that we all have to kind of contribute to flow as individuals? Because the main concept of individual flow, right, is you have to be challenged, but just enough, right? Not
Mm-hmm.
so much that you're struggling and not so little that you're bored. And that's kind of what puts you into the state of flow. How does this connect to organizational flow?
Yeah, I think that what resonates with me as an individual contributor throughout my career is when I was interrupted, disrupted, doing my job as an individual contributor, it's because there was no mechanism for collective flow in the organization. There was no other way to get things done than to kind of interrupt someone and ask for information, ask for something to be done, trigger some kind of response that interrupts individual flow. So I think that for us to really reach individual flow and collective flow, like I see these as interconnected and interdependent. We need these kind of enabling systems that allow for all the contributors to kind of hand off the baton between each other down that value stream towards the customer without having to kind of, pick it up off the ground because it's been dropped, or stop and wonder like, who am I supposed to be passing it to now, or what happens in this case? Like the baton is like, the baton broke, what do I do? Like the batons weighs more than I'm used to. All these things would get in the way. And it's through practice and building this iterative structure, right? The relay race is like standardized. It's everyone knows their role, everyone knows how it works. Um, and I think that, that allows those individual racers in the race to operate at their peak potential whilst operating as part of a team. And so the equivalent in a software product development value stream would be having things like access to self-service capabilities, information, being able to count on SLAs for anything that has to go outside, knowing that, okay, I'm going to send this out to be done, but I know it's going to be back in a day. So I'm going to do another task that's scoped appropriately for that time range. And then I'm not going to have to start something up that's also going to be interrupted when the last thing comes back. Like there's so many interrupts and disruptions in most workflow that I think we can design around, right? We can design solutions to iron out those creases. But traditionally, this isn't a role that exists in organizations, right? I mean, nobody's in charge of workflow. Nobody's in charge of value stream performance.
And nobody
Really.
is looking across teams, right? So one of the things that happens a lot, that we're trying to bring awareness to is, so if you look at like Scrum boards, right? Like they're amazing, they're visual, they let you know what the progress is and what the blockers are, but usually they're within a team. And
Mhm.
there's nothing kind of tracking that flow of work between the teams, or between, like, even if it's a single individual, like someone doing different type of work. And what we see a lot is there's a dot queue sitting at some point and no one is
Mm.
aware of it, no one's checking it. So we're talking about like, oh, we need to go faster in this local like thing that we track,
Right.
and then we don't look at the whole flow.
Yeah, and the consequences of that, are kind of another hidden influence on customer outcomes, because you'll probably be rewarded for that micro optimization, right? But if you start piling up work in development, let's say, and then you throw it all over to operations and say, we're done our part, like, good luck. You could have fully functioning code, but it might not be compatible with the next version of infrastructure that's being piloted. And so that operations team has to do a translation, because they're doing that work to make their lives easier, and they haven't necessarily sold the rest of the organization on the benefits of that, because they're not in sales, they're not in the business of really making business cases. And so they could be working on this in the background, trying to make their lives a little bit easier, trying to understand that that makes everyone's lives easier when you have more flexible and scalable infrastructure, or more resilient, whatever it is. So they could be working on current state and future state in parallel to some degree. Things are being thrown at them for current state, and they're doing a migration to future state just to test things out. All these things are kind of hidden, right? And unless you're looking at the entire value stream, you might be saying that dev's doing an excellent job, ops is like barely keeping it together, and then product can be off, you know with their feet kicked up, because they could just be throwing vague requirements into the system, into the value stream, and counting on a bunch of thrash, and that no one's paying attention to how long it takes from inception of something in the backlog to when development actually picks it up. And so you've got like 6 months upstream, a week in the middle that everyone's super proud of, and they're trying to get it down to like 4 days. And then you've got like 6 weeks again downstream of that. And the whole time the customer's just like, I just want some stuff. Just
So
send me
I think
any of the things I'm asking for.
I think you bring me to. So I like Dora metrics. I like that we popularize, tracking certain indicators, right? But there is a couple problems. You pointed out one, because I think Dora tracks lead time from the time of commit.
Yeah.
which is way different at time of ideation, which is what you pointed out, right? So ideas could be sitting there for a year and they're not included in this metric that we're looking at.
Hmm.
And then I have seen teams that struggle with the release specifically, right? So they go like the development is done, quote unquote, but like they can't get over the milestone, and that's because they're not actually planning for release. They're not engineering for
Hmm.
production. They're just developing code, and there's kind of no consideration for how this code needs to run or even be deployed. And now this situation has improved tremendously from 10 years ago, but
Yes.
it's still a big problem because I think we have convinced everybody that they need to go faster, but we didn't really talk about quality, like, right, we didn't really talk about like what it takes to maintain systems. And
And
so go ahead.
we also didn't clarify what faster means, right? Like faster for who? Faster for Dora metrics or faster for customers? And it turns out almost nobody means faster for customers, because they're incentivizing faster for Dora metrics.
And there's, first of all, there's all sorts of ways to gain metrics, right? And
Hmm.
if you're only looking at one or two, then you're very likely to end up with a problem because you over optimize like one thing. um, but it is interesting that like a lot of organizations that come to us for advice is like if the conversation starts with we need to deploy faster, and then we
Hmm.
start looking at things, it's like that is not your problem. Like
Hmm.
deploying faster is not your problem. Have you actually figured out that you're delivering actual value and your customers are happy? Like, do you need to actually deploy more
Hmm.
features that customers don't care about while not having the ideal customer
Right.
experience there?
It,
So,
isn't this is like a chronic problem, right? I mean, everyone goes to the doctor saying like, I need painkillers for my knee. And it's like, okay, well, that we could solve that problem, but that's not actually the problem. That's not actually the thing that's happening. It's like, it's not even your knee, it's your hip. And your hip is because you don't have the right orthotics in your shoe, and you keep wearing the wrong shoes for the type of movement that you're doing, and you don't do movement exercise. Like there's all these things that are like behind, right? These preconditions that are just manifesting themselves in like knee pain.
yeah. Yeah, so that's an interesting analogy. I do think that a lot of like culturally, like doctors also sometimes tell you that here, I'm just going to inject you with this thing.
Right.
It's going to
Well,
help.
they can be incentivized by all kinds of
Yeah. And
messy incentives.
And I think maybe that's a good parallel to some of the consultants in the industry, right? Who will just come in and be like, oh, we have these three metrics, and we're
Right.
gonna, no matter what happens, if you bring us in, we're gonna optimize to these three metrics and tell you,
Hmm.
like velocity is one that everybody's always talking about. It's like, oh, we got faster. Did you get faster? Did you just break up stories a little bit smaller? Like,
Hmm.
what are we talking about? It's my favorite one to pick on because it's one that is used a lot and it's one that's like super easy to game and it actually doesn't like display like any actual results.
Hmm. Yeah,
Be
like
silly to
customer
watch.
impacting results.
Well, so that's an interesting one. I think the reason people don't track value is because it's hard. Like, okay,
Yes.
it's
Oh,
difficult
so
to
hard.
define metrics that are concerning delivery of value, and it's easy. So if you dig into like the whole metric systems, a lot of it comes up with like it's easy to track activity. It's hard to track outcomes, right? So
Hmm.
a lot of times when you introduce metrics, it actually starts leaning into tracking activity. And that's kind of people optimize and they get great results on paper and they're like nothing actually moves anywhere.
Hmm. Yeah, because I think that you have to start in a different place if you want to measure those things. Like you can measure leading indicators at any time, right? I've poured the right amount of water in for my recipe, but you have to really have a sort of hypothesis in order to evaluate an outcome. Like, did I make a good cake? Like, I can look at a cake that comes out of the oven and be like, "That's a good cake." But, I mean, did I wanna make a cake? Right? Like, was I really specific about the level of quality that I wanted and the experience that I wanted to create and how I wanted to pair that with the rest of the things on the menu? Like, all those considerations, you really can't put them together downstream. You've got to formulate those hypotheses. You have to sort of create that vision upstream before you even start. And that's the hard thing, right? Like, thinking ahead is a habit that we don't really like. I didn't learn that in school. It's not part of conventional wisdom anywhere that I've ever been. And even when I was going to, business school, you're thinking about really high level business strategy, not the empirical method, right? And I
Yeah.
think it's very rare in tech to see that. But we know that the highest performers and the best organizations do think that way, right? And they tell everyone all the time, this is how we do it. We work backwards. We think about outcomes, and it's a hard practice to adopt, I think, because it also depends on a number of other cultural foundation points, right? Sits on top of a foundation of a number of other good practices. It doesn't just live on its own.
So I love analogies and I like the cake analogy. I think generally it's easier for people to grasp ideas when you have a good analogy, like put it in real life and let them visualize. So I love the cake analogy. So here for the cake
Thanks.
analogy, it's like one set of terrible metrics is you just did I put in the right ingredients? Like it's a good
Hmm.
metric, but it doesn't actually track what you want, right? And then the other thing is like, oh, we can now bake the cake 3 minutes faster. It's like, is the
Right.
cake good? Is it underbaked? Is it like like, what's the point of going faster if you're not tracking value as well, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So like that's a pretty good one. I think I on the cultural thing, I was talking to John Willis the other day, and he was talking about how in some cultures, like in Japan, like sort of lean approach is so ingrained that like you can talk to kids in elementary school and they kind of think in these ways and they're trained to think in these ways. And so like when we bring it to Western culture, we sort of tell people what to do and they kind of go halfway.
Hmm.
And so like you have great ideas, but eventually like you actually don't end up implementing them fully. And so then again, the baby gets thrown out with bathwater every
Right.
time, like right? Because it's like, oh, we tried agile, it doesn't work. We tried lean, it doesn't work. We tried DevOps, it doesn't work. It's like, but did you really?
Yeah. Well, this gets to, I think, another fundamental or foundational aspect of organizational culture in the West is that it's very individualistic, right? So when we're talking about flow, everyone cares about personal flow, right? Everyone cares about, I got to stay in the zone. I got to create conditions so that I can work effectively. We all know that we need to work collectively and that we often really enjoy teamwork, but we're often incentivized on individual performance. And so that tension is very real. And if you give someone uh, the choice between measuring individuals and measuring teams, they often will choose individuals on both sides, right? Because it's very difficult to come together as a team, stay together as a team, build trust, build the right behaviors and rituals and culture, and then incentivize the right things without like slipping into, well, this person's underperforming, or why can't everyone be more like this person over here who's our 10x developer? Uh, that kind of just keeps creeping in often, right? Because it's easy to focus on individuals and isolate individuals, just like it's easy to sort of like focus on micro optimizations or focus on individual incidents outside of the overall system.
And there's one more thing that's very predominant in Western culture, and it's actually been getting worse. And that's the focus on short-term outcomes, right?
Hmm.
So I recently like realized that like it what company performance wasn't always managed quarter by quarter, right? People actually used to look at like 10 years outlook and look at dividends and like this was the kind of the important arc. And now
Hmm.
Wall Street is increasingly like it's all about did you meet the estimate and the estimates are made up, right? So did
Right.
you meet the made up estimates for this 3 months? And measuring performance in 3 months removes all sorts of things that you can do, right? Because you
Hmm.
you you can't. It's a very short term outlook, and the a lot of times the easiest ways to optimize the 3 months is to forget about the 10 years down the line.
Yeah, I mean, it's very hard to work against that level of urgency and that iteration because it also plays into the same instinct that we have for projects, right? It's nice to have 100-yard dash. When you think about a marathon, you're like, oh, there's so many things that could go wrong. You need, an incredible level of discipline. Most people can think about, yeah, I could run I might not do a good job, but I could run 100 yards and I would probably finish it. Um, but, or 100 meters. But I think when we start to think longer term, what happens when generative AI pops up and everyone, all of your competition is seizing this opportunity because they can drop everything that they were working on and just start focusing on this. And I think that people are afraid of that situation where they're stuck in a long-term decision, um, because often you need to do that well. I think you need a very strong set of principles, a very strong vision, very strong teams and support culture. You have to be really connecting your decisions and your actions to data so that you know when something's a fad and when something actually makes sense. And you have to have a really strong sense of your own identity to say that, we're going to let this pass now, but because of the way that we're setting up our vision, once it crosses this specific milestone, we'll start to look at it. And I think that that is extremely rare. And it's very hard to let a fad go by because everyone is trying to catch all the waves.
Yeah, and we were talking about this one interesting metric that's mean time to leadership change. And it's like
Mm-hmm.
if you're starting an initiative, it's really important to consider what's your outlook on how long your leadership is going to be around, and what's the chances that like if leadership changes, they will still want to continue with this, or are they just going to like shut the whole effort down and start something new because that's kind of how we operate. And again, this is very different in Eastern and Western cultures because in Eastern cultures you sometimes see like people looking at 100 years, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas both are companies and countries. And in the West, it's like, more than a year never ever crosses anybody's mind, right?
Right. Who knows what's going to happen in a
Yeah.
year?
And we spent 3 months developing a 1 year strategy. And, you know,
Yes. Oh, the tyranny of OKRs, right?
um, do you want to talk about OKRs? And
We
I
could
have
we could talk about OKRs all day. Yeah.
I have kind of like love-hate relationship with OKRs because I think on one hand goals are good and the idea of kind
Hmm.
of cascading goals is good. Um, but on the other, again, like y- every metric you will kind of drive behavior, and it's really difficult to consider everything when you go in and not start to just drive everybody towards seeking rewards.
it's really interesting to consider that cascading dynamic in OKRs and how uh, it runs counter to so much of what we talk about outside of OKRs. Like, if we're not talking about OKRs, everybody wants bottom up, everybody wants generative, um, let's say collaborative organizations where everyone sort of self organizes. And then we get to OKRs and it's like, okay, well, like the directors can't plan anything because they haven't heard from the VPs what they should be doing yet. And then they have to align everything that they're doing to the VPs, and it has to connect all the way up from the bottom. And the individual contributor at the bottom of the line is getting their OKRs like finalized in June for the current year as a result. And so I think it's really an interesting challenge to hold these two ideas in your organization's mind at the same time. The fact that you want more self-organizing, you want more autonomy, and yet everyone loves OKRs, and we love that ability to connect the dots all the way down and see that this contribution is feeding this key result, which is going to deliver this objective, and that's feeding this. And that sounds so satisfying, and yet it's incredibly inefficient, right? I mean, that's the equivalent of running the internet from like a token ring system, or like an old school networking paradigm where everything has to be centralized and routed, or it has to get like everything has to basically flow through the entire organization. I think in many ways OKRs work against the current culture of organizations. I don't think they work against organizations that are kind of built with that paradigm in mind, with a degree of like benevolent dictator for life. You have very clear degrees of freedom, but in terms of strategic objectives, we are top down, right?
So I actually have to disagree with you a little bit. And I
Right.
think so. I don't like the focus on autonomy that we have. I prefer the word agency. And the difference
Mm-hmm.
between the two for me is if we're talking about autonomy, autonomy really means I do what I want, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like if you
Mm-hmm.
actually go read the Agile Manifesto, there's a lot of that in there. Like developers do what they want, no one can tell them what to do, which is like this is great in theory, but it also isn't exactly what we want to do because as an individual contributor, I very rarely have the full picture about where my organization wants to go, right? So the idea that strategy is decided upon kind of somewhere upstairs is a good idea, like because ideally my executive leadership actually knows where they want to go with the organization, but
Right.
also this has to be, and this is difficult, right? But it has to be combined with the idea that feedback loops have to come from bottom up, right? So it's not that the bottom actually designs the strategy, because I don't think they have enough information to design the strategy, but they have to be able to give feedback on the strategy because like one of the things we talked about is like the one of the very important things about your strategy is your people, your individual contributors have to be able to believe it is achievable. Because
Yeah.
if you're
Right.
there on stage talking about how we're gonna, I don't know, win the AI competition and take over the market, and your individual contributors like, we're so our capabilities have nothing to do with this, and
Mm-hmm.
we're swamped and we're barely delivering on our current stuff, and we cannot possibly learn this, then like there's such a disconnect. No one's actually gonna even try to do what
Mm-hmm.
the strategy says, right? So the problem in a lot of organizations is like, well, first of all, strategy doesn't even propagate down, right? It's kind of what you talked
Mm-hmm.
about, like, it takes 6 months to cascade the OKRs if they even exist, or there's like a single email that comes out to the entire organization saying, here's our North Star and here's what we want you to do. And it's like, these are words, they're vague, they're like
Hmm.
massive. Like I don't know how that relates to what I do every day, right? So there's no like strategy propagation down the line. And then the other big problem is there's no propagation of the feedback up the line. And one of the things that happens is so individual contributors say raises the hand and says we can't do this project or product, right? Like we don't have the capability.
Mm.
Here's 10 concerns that I have with it, right? And then their manager goes, this sounds very like strong. I'm gonna like mild it down, sends upstairs with a few less concerns, a few milder words. That happens like five, six, 7 times, gets through the executive leadership, and basically that feedback is, well, we have a couple of concerns, but we think we can really succeed with this
Right.
product. And
Right.
then the bottom level kind of gives up on the idea of giving feedback because they're like, well, we've been screaming for 6 months and no one's listening to us, so we're just
Hmm.
going to stop screaming and do what the top leadership says without having any consideration for what we think. And so there's this disconnect between like ability to give feedback. So like if you think about Toyota, right? The idea is that anybody can stop the line, right?
Yeah.
I don't think that ever has really worked in most American companies. Like,
Hmm.
I don't think most individual contributors are empowered to stop the line here.
No, I don't think so. And there is very much I think, a cultural reason for that. You know, this very much, especially in Silicon Valley, um, this, it's not just individualism, it's rugged individualism. It's basically like, make it work. Rather than let's catch faults in the system and address them before they become bigger. It's like, you have duct tape, you have skills, uh, patch the hole and keep going. And I think that, that your message about the feedback loop is, I totally agree with that. I think that that's another Eastern influence. We're talking a lot about East and West here. It's awesome. But the Eastern influence, I think, that
Isn't what I
has to
was
be.
going for. It just happened.
I love it. It's great. I mean, I think it actually puts things into contrast, which helps kind of define, um, you know, our surroundings, which are largely Western. But I think what has to be paired, and I haven't really revisited Measure What Matters to see if it goes into this, but I think you have to pair OKRs with their grandfather, which was Hoshin Kanri, right? Like, you have to have built in strategy deployment, right? Where you have this very clear cascade with oh, that's interesting. and and you have to build in the catchball method, right? You have to build in that feedback loop um, that makes it actually function for everybody, rather than just this thing that kind of trickles down in the worst way that we know of.
I think I like the Measure What Matters book, but what kind of like removes teeth out of it for me is it was talking so much about Google and there was so much this like we had unlimited money to invest in these
Yeah,
projects,
yeah,
right? That I'm
exactly.
like, if I had $1 billion to build this, OKRs or not, probably be fine,
Yeah.
right?
But this actually, I think, is another chronic problem in the West, is that we really love to follow a positive influence, right? We have this mimetic desire is extremely strong in the West, where you want to copy and steal what's working from the
Isn't
best
it just
performers.
human? Kind of like we all want to mimic
Yes,
the behavior that we think is successful.
absolutely. But I think it's very ingrained, in the West. But certainly, yes, it's definitely a human. It's a human behavior, and I
So,
think
so
that we don't really consider the other conditions that are attached to that success.
well, And again, we can learn from success, and like the thing is, like you need to contextualize it, right? So on the opposite side of this, I love the SRE book, and I think the SRE book gave a lot of information and a lot of good guidance and a lot of kind of, to me, it's like we were talking about DevOps for 10 years, but someone actually wrote it down actually in terms of how you can measure certain things that will help you know if you're doing better or worse, and help you have explicit agreements between teams. Like, I think the biggest thing that SRE does, if you actually follow the book and follow the advice, is make you have agreements between product and developers and operations. And one of the things, I think we talked about it offline a little bit, is empowering operations to say no to things. It's one of, like, I think people miss that, right?
Hmm.
So like when people talk about SRE, they're like, oh, SRE is just this team, other team that, supports stuff or whatever. Um, but there is an explicit concept of like production readiness reviews, and SRE has the power to say, no, we're not going to support your stuff. Like it's not
Hmm.
production ready. This is not working well enough, and we're not going to answer calls for this. And until you make it better, you're going to answer call for this. How many organizations have we seen in the wild where like when devs push a new product on ops, the ops can say, we're not supporting this.
Hmm.
I don't think that happens a lot.
No, I don't think so, because I think that too often it's not paired with a prior agreement that has established some sense of clarity across all those different stakeholders. So, if I say I'm not going to do something, it's very disruptive if I'm saying that without any prior warning or any kind of expectation set around what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. And that, when I define what's acceptable and not acceptable, it has to be agreed upon from everybody upstream and downstream, or else, it's really just, I don't know if this is the right term, but like, it's just like overly demanding diva behavior to say that I want to do this and I don't want to do that,
But
especially
but
when my job
but
description
here's the
is like
thing, like,
covers all those things in the abstract.
but here's the thing. I feel like we let developers, and again, I have to caveat this. I did development for probably 10 years before I ever did more opsy things, right? And like I think we let developers be divas all day, and then it comes to ops, and they're like, just that we just push stuff down on ops, and we're like, deal with it, and that's a problem, right? Because
I think
we
that's
we
true for
we
every
let
upstream
developers.
downstream relationship, like dev and ops, product and dev, executives and products,
Right, that's fair
sales,
enough.
and like I think it's kind of the nature of upstream downstream, and but it's very true.
And I think like when the DevOps movement started, like when the DevOps movement gained traction, we actually improved the ops position, right? So ops got more
Hmm.
more power, more money, more ability to do smart things. Because like in a lot of organizations, it wasn't even possible to like to automate things. Like people would be told not to automate things, as a for instance, like right, like this is what I don't like about it. Like, oh, we Google figured out that you need to automate things. Like, no, we knew
Yeah.
this all along. But A, we didn't have the tools. Sometimes we didn't have the money. Sometimes there was too much variation, right? Because this is something that cloud providers have that no one else has. It's like I can order this server being exactly in this spec. Most enterprises cannot do that. Like they just don't have enough infrastructure to be able to,
Hmm.
you know, design their own server racks and stuff like that. And that reduction of variability is very important to supportability. But then we do the same thing in dev. Like in tech first organizations, there's actually not as much variability. Like people are developing in certain standards, certain languages, certain procedures, right? And then you go to enterprise and it's like you've got every language, every technology,
Hmm.
every like service stack, everything, right? And it's all getting basically pushed downstream. And then the ops person has to show up and figure out like, what does this even do? Where does this live? how does this run and how do I now make it work? Like how do I recover it if it's dead? Like
Mhm.
there's so much challenge in here that sort of kind of we wish didn't exist.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that, you know, that starts with, I talk about three things all the time: clarity, value, and flow. And I think that the clarity part and the value part really fight jockey for kind of first position. Like flow is always follows after. You have to figure out what the right thing to do is before you can kind of operationalize it and do it well, sustainably and at scale. But the clarity and the value part, I think, go kind of hand in hand. And I go back and forth on whether which one should be first. But I think that you really almost always start with value. And the value part really, I think, launched DevOps into prominence because, to your point, like everyone's talked about automation since, I don't know, the 50s. And what really gets these things to kick off is understanding the value of investment. Otherwise, you can't just get, like, no one has the social capital to just get time and space to do things they want to do. Like, we all have a giant backlog of stuff to do. And we've already decided on all that stuff. So, like, if you want to be doing something else, like, you're going to have to make a really good case. So, it was really helpful to have these extremely successful organizations demonstrate a model of success and demonstrate possibilities that could be copied by other organizations. Because I think, before you get buy-in for anything, you have to share a very compelling vision at least. And then ideally, you have a hypothesis about impact and outcomes. And without those things, it's very difficult to justify an investment in automation or process improvement or anything. And that's taken a while to really trickle down, or let's say spread out throughout the technical community. And now we talk about these things all the time. We talk about outcomes, we talk about incentives, we talk about all these preconditions for doing the things that everyone knows we have to do and we've known forever. But what should that look like? And how do we connect it to the business? And how do we make sure that the individual contributors understand that vision so that they can make the right decisions on all the compromises that they have to make when they're building things out? Like, all those dots were not really connected for a very long time, and I feel like they are starting to be connected, but it's not evenly distributed yet.
The future is here, but it's not evenly distributed. I think so. So you do a lot of value stream mapping, right? And I think one of the things that like you can kind of see as a goal of value stream mapping is revealing bottlenecks, right? And kind of reducing that um, piles of work in a particular spot of the stream. But does it at all help with that feedback loop? So like you kind of mentioned this, and this I think is absolutely correct. Whenever you have the upstream downstream relationship, like workflows down,
Hmm.
it has problems like having a feedback loop back, and that creates a lot of turbulence in that flow. Um, does value stream mapping help solve this problem?
Yeah, so this is a humbling subject for me, because one of the things that I don't often mandate and even carve out specific attention for is information flow, which is kind of a native aspect of value stream mapping. So it's two primary dimensions of a value stream are kind of workflow and information flow. Workflow goes upstream, downstream. Information flow goes downstream, upstream. And I spend a lot of time on workflow because that's what my customers want to focus on. That's what people People care about what's getting done. And it's something you have to fight for. You have to basically point out that to make this a functioning system, you can't just be pushing work. You have to be collecting data on the outputs, the outcomes, the artifacts, the incidents, all of the effects of that work in order to improve the system continually. You can value stream map every 3 to 6 months, and you're going to have a totally different map if you're actually improving over time. But you could actually improve the system every day if you have a functioning information flow, right? And the way that you kind of make that explicit and clear is with a value stream map that covers those dimensions. And a lot of people will focus on the work because there's a lot when it comes to the work. There's enough, right? I mean, people really, they have a hard time justifying investment into a value stream map because they think of every moment you're not working is waste. But in reality, all the time that you're working is probably full of waste, and you can't see it unless you map the value stream. But even if we're just focusing on the work, you have the activities performed, you have the timing of each of those activities, you have the wait time between those activities. And it's often really valuable to do things like highlight what roles are involved in each of those activities, what tools are being hit across that workflow. There's a ton of dimensions that you can add, but information flow gets very little attention. And a lot of folks don't have anyone kind of intentionally designing information flow, much less workflow. But information flow, I don't think gets any attention really.
So it's interesting what you mentioned is like we think that all the time not spent working is waste. And I think this is because like there are certain things we don't have good intuitions for. So
Mm-hmm.
we don't have good intuitions for cues.
Mm-hmm.
Like the way we envision cues work is not how they actually work. And so we kind of, despite, I love what theory of constraints has done, but I think it's an interesting one because like everyone feels like they know what it's about, but like really not a lot of people kind of internalize it. And so again, we constantly optimize for everyone being busy rather
Mm-hmm.
than work flowing through. And we dismiss the fact that like if you have bottlenecks in your queue, the downstream effect is a lot bigger than than you would think. Like once the queue is stopped and the work is not getting through a bottleneck, like you're not just slowing down a little bit, you're slowing down tremendously. Like it's an exponential curve that starts climbing up, right? And I think that's what we don't realize.
Well, I think the other piece that is counterintuitive is the idea that by optimizing anywhere other than the constraint, you are actually making things worse. We often think that any improvement is improvement, but if you're actually, let's say, forcing more work into a constrained activity, then you're actually making things worse than doing nothing, right? You'd be better off doing nothing. And that's very counterintuitive. Um,
You
and
you had a couple of good analogies. Do you have any good analogies for that? Because like I don't necessarily know how to explain this. Well, I like
yeah, I mean, the first, I've my whole life has been flow without realizing it. I think everybody's has been, but I've really grappled with this because it's now this focus of my professional life. But one of the first instances was like I made pizzas, like one of my first jobs. My first real job was making pizzas. And so if you consider the fact that you can't just nuke a pizza in an oven and cook it, like back to the baking thing, you can't just bake something as fast as possible and do it successfully unless you have, you've designed the system for that. because I also know that there are places where they'll run a 1600-degree oven and they'll cook a pizza in 12 seconds, which is a place in Japan, actually, bring us back. It's a place in Japan I tried to get to where they supposedly cook pizza super fast, but I never made it in time. They were closed by the time I got there. But so let's consider the fact that the oven is a constraint. You can produce ready to bake pizzas at an incredible rate, and eventually, it piles up to the point where you have storage concerns, you have safety concerns, you have workflow concerns, just dealing with the amount that you have produced that's ready
Of
for,
inventory.
right, ready for the next stage. And if we bring that to the software world, because not everything physical is manifested in software, but you know the more you pile up, let's say waiting for code review, you're incredibly productive in the development activity, and you pile up tons of work for code review. All of a sudden, everybody reviewing code is going to want to prioritize that list, because they're going to say, okay, well, there's 100 things here. I don't want to go through these as if each one is the same. So I'm going to try to figure out how to sort these and prioritize these so that I can be most effective. That's cognitive load and strain on the system. There's probably conversations about, okay, we have tons of stuff to review. Which one should we start with? Well, the developer says, well, I don't really know. I just built it all. So we go and talk to product. Which one of these? And they're like, oh, none of that's through yet. Like, just start cranking it out, but like batch these things. Like, we need these ones to go. And then you look at, okay, well, for me to put those ones out, then I really probably should do this, because they didn't know anything about the technical requirements that were dictating the order of operations here. And so we're reshuffling all the time. We might be sending things back. Like, all of a sudden I'm noticing a pattern that we're producing a bunch of stuff. These are challenges of queuing, but there are also natural behaviors. When we're faced with a large amount of information and a large amount of work, we're going to want to manage it. And so making it necessary to manage that work adds a dimension to the job that shouldn't be there, right? All of a sudden you have two jobs: code review and managing all the work that's piled up waiting for you to manage it. And then all of a sudden, you start to optimize for the wrong things, like speed of code review, right? Instead of quality, you're going to be incentivized to just get them out as quickly as possible, which is not the goal, right? So it really does make a lot of things worse to be accumulating inventory, because you're forced to track different success metrics. And I think that's a fundamental challenge. And I'm sure there's a lot more that TOC experts would highlight there. But to me, it's like, once you have work start piling up, it's an extra strain. We talk about cognitive load a lot, and I think that queuing is a massive impact on cognitive load.
So basically, we're saying like inventory is way less obvious in software, but it still exists and it's still a problem. I don't have a good example, because like these examples we're talking about, and this can happen at every like sort of gate. And I like gates. I think gates are good as long as
Mm-hmm.
the gates can like be automated and have flow, like
Right.
work flow through them. And once you pass a quality gate, you know that you have a certain standards of performance, right? So it makes your life easier and reduces rework. But if you have, say, manual QA, or you have security at the very end of the line, that can return anything, and
Mm-hmm.
you have all this stuff like piling up for a couple months and then being returned in a big chunk, where like the developer has to go and remember what the hell they did 3 months ago and
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And search for this big pile of code instead of just searching through one thing. Um, all of this is like rework and turbulence, and it slows you down tremendously. So basically, we're saying like it's not as visible that you're tripping over your inventory, but it still exists and it still creates the same kinds of problems, and it slows you down tremendously. And I think, in addition to slowing you down, it also creates a lot of quality problems and a lot of like increases potential mistakes and um, decreases satisfaction of people who are working with it.
Definitely. And you know, when we're confronted with a large, let's say, accumulation of work, we enter into these like natural reaction patterns. Like we want to batch things, we want to pattern match, we want to find, okay, what's the one thing that's going to knock off 30% of this, what's the 20% that's going to address 80% of this. That's only natural, right? I mean, it's unnatural to kind of robotically just first in first out, all that stuff, right? Because we have these assumptions about what is the most efficient way to process cues, and sometimes our instincts are correct, sometimes they're incorrect. But you know, the fact that when we start to see work piling up, all of a sudden it's almost like we stop doing our original job and we now have a new job of queue management and breaking down a backlog. Whereas we know also, I mean, fundamentally, this isn't like a law of nature, but like slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? That the fact that if you have a predictable, consistent flow, you can make much better decisions about optimizing a system than if you have these constraints, because our attention will just zero in on the constraint, and but not in a constructive way. You know, we manage the constraint, we don't elevate the constraint, right? So we sort of like work within the conditions that are created by the constraint instead of instinctively swarming to remove the constraint. You know, we sort of like become I Love Lucy on the assembly line with the chocolates coming by. And she's like, instead of yelling at someone, you know, in the factory to turn the machine off, she starts eating all the chocolates, right? Like that's the natural, that's the panic that we sort of naturally fall into, is just making it work, just managing the situation instead of addressing the constraint. And I think that value stream mapping really forces us, you know, it's a kind of a enabling function to confront the constraint as it exists as a part of the entire system, and focus our efforts on elevating the constraint rather than managing it, like making do with the status quo.
Well, and again, how many people are empowered to go tell someone upstream to slow down or
Right.
stop? Like, right? Like, and how many people are aware that they're in the constraint and like, again, not feeling like personally responsible and like this
Right.
is all my problem and I need to work faster and so or something like that. Um, and then again, this is like even bigger problem, but and I think value stream mapping really helps with this is like having dark work, like right, you don't even know that the work exists and it's just sitting somewhere, like
Hmm.
I don't know, there's some email that's sitting in someone's inbox for 3 weeks before anybody picks it up or something like that, and like people are not even aware that there's a huge pile of work, and
Hmm.
like the reason it's not going through is this particular, I don't know, approval that someone needs to click a button that they always click yes, but they don't even know
Right.
that this thing exists.
Yeah, because we, you know, we sort of organically, incrementally design these systems without intentionality, right? We don't say, this is how I want it to work. And these are the inflection points with which the scale will mandate a new system or a change to the system. It just sort of, okay, like we figured it out at first, and then we just kept doing it that way. And there was never really a milestone where we would say, okay, well, once we get to this level of volume, or once we see these cracks in the foundation, we will change what we're doing. That level of attention and intentionality is extremely rare, because it brings us back to the beginning of the conversation, nobody is in charge of workflow. Nobody is in charge of information flow explicitly, right? I mean, I would have everyone listening to this go uh, check out the job descriptions of everyone that you think is important, like in charge of flow in your organization, and see how clear it is that that is something that they are like primarily mandated to do in the organization. And I do this all the time, and I never find anyone who's actually empowered to improve the flow in organizations.
So now I know the solution to all of our problems. We just need a value stream officer or something like that. The chief
It's
chief flow
starting to it's
officer.
starting to bubble up. There's a lot of organizations that are adopting roles like value stream architect, for instance, which is kind of specifically targeted at creating better collective flow in organizations.
So I kind of we're about at the end of our time, and I wanted to bring a conversation. I know you're working on finishing a book. So let's
That's
talk
right.
a little bit about, so what's in the book? What is it, how is it relating to everything we talked about today?
It does relate to everything that we talked about today, which is fun to actually think about. The book is tentatively titled Flow Engineering. It's really about enabling flow in organizations from a collective level in order to have the conditions for individual flow. And value stream mapping is kind of the cornerstone of that um, prescription. I hate to say, I like that just set off alarm bells in my head. But basically, the series of activities and methods that are assembled in the book are not prescriptive, but there is an order of operations where you clarify a target outcome collectively with a group of stakeholders, group of people that you work with or across your organization. And then you look at the workflow that is most well positioned to deliver that target outcome. And that's the value stream mapping aspect. And then once you discovered constraints in the value stream, you explore the degree to which those are connected to dependencies outside of the value stream. So it's SLAs with other groups, shared services, approvals, and things like that. So you can start to build out this network view of flow in the organization. And the reason we started with this clarity and value aspect, in addition to just mapping the value stream, is to really effectively map a value stream. You have to understand what the target outcome is. Like I've tried to map value streams in many cases early on by just looking at the workflow. But whether you're inside the company or outside as a consultant, coming in, if you don't know the target, if you don't know what the organization is aiming to achieve, it's very difficult to understand what value stream to focus on, how to define the boundaries of that value stream, and then what to measure inside of that value stream. Because it could be that information flow is the most important missing piece. It could be that quality is the most important aspect that you want to focus on. You can measure all these dimensions, but where you spend your time and attention is dependent on your target outcome. So flow engineering is really about this end-to-end series of activities that you can perform with your colleagues. And if you're, let's say, an external vendor and you want to deeply understand the current state of an organization and where they want to go, you can deploy flow engineering as a set of practices that will take you from, we have a bunch of ideas and pains and questions and context, to clarifying a target outcome, looking at the workflow that's going to deliver that target outcome, and then breaking it down to understand, okay, here's what we can do tomorrow to get started. Here's what we're going to do after, and then later on, and create a roadmap out of everything that you learn throughout that practice. So The book is really kind of like a start to finish set of practices that I've been using for the past 7-8 years to improve development and delivery performance. But I've also applied it in a bunch of weird places like customer onboarding and sales, because it works the same way. Everything has a flow. Like everything that we're doing in organizations has a flow. So flow engineering is kind of this approach that works all over the place.
Well, and I love the focus on outcome. One of the things that are good about value stream mapping is that there's inherent concept of value stream. Like you're actually
Mhm.
going somewhere. It's not just a, it's not just a river. We're actually like arriving somewhere. So like I love that you kind of focusing on outcome because without defining the outcome, how can you tell if you're doing the right thing? And like you can maybe tell if you're doing the thing in the right way, but how can you tell if you're doing the right thing? Um, so I'm looking forward to reading the book. I hope you consider doing an audiobook for it.
Oh,
adding more
definitely. Yeah.
adding more
Yeah.
work
We're
to your
signed up
list.
to do an audiobook as
Nice,
well. So I'm
nice.
excited to do that.
Because I definitely find it personally a lot easier to consume audiobooks than print books. So, but
It's
I
an interesting challenge though, because it's a very visual book. Like a lot of it is mapping, right? A lot of it is mapping with your team. So the audiobook will come with a PDF that kind of takes you through
yeah
everything and you can follow along. But it's interesting to consider the audiobook version of a book on collaborative mapping.
yeah
So we'll see how that goes. But I like over the years, I've developed a bunch of ways to do this just like conversationally instead of having a whiteboard. How you can essentially get the same dynamics by just having a structured conversation. So that's a fun kind of variation on it.
And it's probably where like analogies work really well, right? Because as long as I can picture something that I'm more familiar with, it's probably easier to understand. But yeah, it's an interesting challenge, which I think would probably improve the book, right? Like when if you solve it for audio, it probably makes it better for print as well, and hopefully so.
Yes, yeah, you're right. You're right. I mean, that's one of the challenges is how can you communicate information without relying on a crutch, right? Like I think that's one of the more rewarding things about writing is the fact that you have to test. Like you have to actually say, am I describing this correctly to someone who doesn't have my context, who can't see what I see, who can't imagine or have the experience that I have? That's really, I think, the hardest and most rewarding part of writing is when you put something together and someone who's totally outside of the context says, "Oh yeah, I get that. Like that makes sense to me." Um,
That's a really cool way to approach this because like I tend to try to always think about like my who my audience is and what they can understand of what I'm saying or writing or presenting. And it's good to think about because like not everyone like a lot of times people focus on what they want to say rather than what they want people to hear.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so switching that sometimes also makes it easier for you to just be present for that. Like, um, I don't know if you know the book Presence. I think it's the best book for public speakers. And it doesn't talk about like, should you make eye contact or whatever. It talks about being present. And if you focus on the message and not on yourself, you're much more likely
Mm,
to be successful at delivering the message. You're much less likely to be kind of in your head, being like, "Oh, am I standing right? Am I,
mhm.
am I, am I putting my hands in the proper place or whatever?" It's like I dislike most of speaking advice that's out there on the internet, and I think it
Right.
stresses you out too much without giving you good tools. Um, so last but not least, how can people find you and when should they call you?
Oh yeah. Well, I appreciate that question a lot. I spend most of my time on LinkedIn these days because the Twitterverse is kind of a mess, and so I spend a lot of time on LinkedIn. There's really great discussions actually on LinkedIn in regards to flow, outcome focus, working backwards. And I really enjoy it. It could be that I've crafted the perfect bubble there, but if folks want to connect to me there, I'm happy to bring them into the bubble.
I'd love for
Um,
you to bring me into the bubble because one of my challenges with LinkedIn is I kind of don't get a conversation. Like I get people like
yeah.
say, "Oh, this is great," or whatever. But even if I ask a question, I usually don't get like productive conversation out of it, which has been kind of frustrating.
Well, I really, I really enjoy it these days. And I think it is just because it's been a long time kind of building these conversations with different folks, and a lot of folks I
Building the right
disagree with,
network of
right?
folks. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's great for that. And it does surface, like, it surfaces people that I disagree with on a regular basis, and we hash things out. It's a lot of fun. Um, I spend quite a bit of time in a community that was formed during COVID called the Flow Collective. So you can guess what that's about. But we just really have these conversations every week about all kinds of different areas of flow, collective and personal flow. And
And is that a meetup,
it's just a Slack that we have a Zoom every Wednesday evening Eastern time, and we sort of do a lean coffee every week on whatever is on folks' minds. So sometimes we have challenges with scaling, challenges with metrics, challenges with OKRs, and we've been doing it for, I think, over 2 years now. So we have like these giant mural boards of lean coffees. So anyone joining now gets this like encyclopedia flow that they can just navigate, which we've actually distilled. Like every year we take the whole board and we're like, I'll group all these things together. This is all TOC. Um, this is all metrics. So that's really cool, and I encourage folks to join us there. It's an awesome community, and
all right, we'll share some links in the show notes.
I will, yeah, and then folks call me for all kinds of different reasons. One common one that's really interesting at the moment is folks are starting to look at how customer journey connects to value streams, and really kind of arriving at this idea of a value stream network without even knowing it. There's a lot of folks who don't necessarily know the difference between a customer journey and a value stream, and they'll reach out to me and say, we have this issue with our customer journey. Is that something that you can help us with? And so about a year and a half ago, I had to learn customer journey mapping and how to connect all these inflection points in the customer journey to the value streams that deliver all those capabilities. And that's been incredible. It really has kind of built this extra understanding of how organizations are arranged in terms of flow and customer outcomes rather than the org chart, right? So you kind of reverse engineering how the organization works from the customer outcome perspective. And so there's a lot of folks who are driving for more value, more delivered value, better customer outcomes. But still the most common is we need to go faster. And so it's like taking that goal and figuring out, okay, what does that mean to you? What does that mean in your context? And how do we make faster sustainable and actually connected to better outcomes rather than just, spinning your wheels in place as fast as possible?
The connection to the customer journey actually sounds like a very interesting topic and also like something that makes total sense
Hmm.
to be connected to and kind of probably puts you even more in this like outcome oriented shoes. All right, well, we're at time for sure. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. And I will put some links in the show notes to be able to find Steve and Steve's website and all the communities. And we'll see you next time on an Ergonatic podcast. Bye.
Thank you so much.